Welcome to Your College Bound Kid,
a podcast for parents, college counselors, students, and anyone who wants a weekly deep dive into the world of college admissions.
My name is Vince, and I've been doing admissions since 1989 and college counseling since 1998 in California.
I'm Lisa, and I'm a clinical psychologist and college counselor. I have a daughter in college, a daughter in high school, and a son in middle school. After 30 years in Chicago, we recently moved to North Carolina.
My name is Mark. I'm a college coach in Atlanta and the parent of two daughters. Karis, a graduate of Davidson College, and she is the founder of the Spanish tutoring company, SpanishHelpToday.com. And Joy is a wellness coach at the Keenan Flagler Business School at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. And I'm so blessed to be able to work alongside both my beautiful daughters at School Match for You, a college counseling firm that I founded in 2010. Good afternoon, friends. I'm calling an audible today. For those of you who don't know what that means, it's a football term. So when a quarterback changes the play at the line of scrimmage just before the ball is snapped, based on what he sees in the defense. So originally I was going to share a couple different real scenarios from the counseling room. Two from Texas families and one from a Maryland family. I'm going to push those off to another day. So I want to share a story that true story, probably 6-7 years ago. I'm talking with a financial aid officer at a conference. And I asked the financial aid officer a question. I said, would you prefer if the student contacts you or if the parent contacts you when they have a financial aid question? So the response from the financial aid officer was, either one is fine. We totally understand parents need to be involved because there's so many things that we talk about, whether it's W-2 earnings, assets, unique expenses, untaxed income, that really only parents can relate to. But, and I remember this, it pulls on my heartstrings when the student reaches out, because the student is why we do this. And she said, my colleagues feel the same way. So how does that relate to today? Well, a question from a listener came in from Eva, who's a student, and it pulled on my heartstrings. And I decided I'm going to put this right up to the top of the line and answer it, because when students send in questions, we really do try to prioritize them and move them to the top whenever possible. And so it didn't work out. Carter from Virginia had a question he sent in a couple months ago, actually. But we tried to answer that. We had tech issues, and then I went on my Texas trip for over 3 weeks. So that one took a while to get to, but really we did try to get student questions right to the top. So I want to answer Eva's question today, and it has to do with why I have soured on BSMD programs. And so I'm going to get into 9 cons, in my opinion, to BSMD programs, and 4 pros. I want to try to be balanced with this. So I want to present the positives and, in my opinion, the negatives. And I'll share why, in my opinion, the negatives outweigh the positives. So, but like always, it's always about fit and match. It doesn't mean that a BSMD program may never be appropriate for anybody, but you're just going to hear my perspective over the years working with students applying to these programs and why I'm not a fan. And then we have a brand new interview. I'm really stoked about this interview. Lynda did it. It's with Jay Hall, who's an educator in Oklahoma. He's got a new book out, College Unpacked, and he's going to get into that book. But I also met with Jay. I met with Jay on my Texas trip before Lynda did, and before she read the book. I had read chapters of the book, and I asked her if she would do this interview, and I was really glad she agreed to do it. It was just hard for me to do on my Texas trip. But what Jay's going to focus on is successfully transitioning to college. So we have a lot of listeners who have students in college. In fact, our last survey, we need to do a new survey, by the way. Our last survey was 2022. I can't believe it's 3 years ago. But I don't imagine too much has changed. We had almost 250 responses. And at that time, 31% of our listeners have a student in college. So, they also usually have one in high school, but that's okay. So we like to have some content for college students. And this is particularly, I think, apropos because the focus is on students transitioning to college who just graduated class of 2025. How can they successfully transition, and how can they have a great first year experience? And so Lynda will interview Jay on that topic over the next 4 weeks. So you have part one of 4 today. I do have a favor to ask of our listeners. If you ever hear an interview and you find it moving or very helpful, a number of you reach out to me, and it's encouraging to me anytime I hear that, because you kind of put a lot of content out there. Lynda calls me a content machine. Never forget when she said that. But you put a lot of content out there, and you kind of don't always know what lands and what doesn't land unless you get feedback. So I do appreciate hearing if something you find particularly helpful. Got a lot of responses already to the Kettering University interview and to Frankie interview. But what I'm asking for you to do is to take 5 minutes of your time and to email the person who did the interview. We're interviewing some very, very busy people who are taking time out to do this. And, it's tough out there in higher ed right now. You have no idea how you can make their day, maybe even their week, with your kind words. And that's the main reason I want you to do it. I'm all about encouraging. But I do have a second ancillary reason. It really is secondary, but I would be remiss to not share it with you. So if I ever want a guest to come back on and they are able to say to me what Christina Lopez from Barnard said when I saw her at a conference, she's like, oh my goodness, I had no idea when I went on your podcast how many people would come out and reach out to me about that interview I did. I can get them back. The way we were able to get Andy Strickler from an interview to being a co-host was the responses that you all directed to him. He said the same thing. He said, I had no idea that so many people were going to reach out and tell me they found that interview to be helpful. And he said, I'll hear it when I'm traveling. So if you can do that, it accomplishes 2 things. It encourages the listener, makes their day, maybe even their week. Who knows what kind of week they're having. And it really puts us in a great position if we ever want to have them back again. Normally, you can just Google their name, take you right to, whatever organization they're with, and you can get their email. But if I don't want you wasting 10 minutes on that, feel free to just email me, mark@schoolmatchforyou.com, schoolmatch number 4 letter U, not FORYOU, schoolmatch number 4 letter U.com, and ask for their email. I'll be happy to share it with you. All right, let's dive in. I want to talk to you about this student and Eva and what it was that she said that captured my attention. So we'll play for the question right now, and we'll take it from there.
Hi, this is Eva. I'm a rising senior in Austin, Texas. My mom is a regular listener who provides me with highlights and often insists I listen to. She told me that on the June 2nd episode, you mentioned that you aren't a fan of BSMD programs. I asked her why, and she said, ask Mark. So I'm asking, as a rising senior very interested in BSMD programs, what are your reservations about pursuing them? Also, my mom got to meet you in Austin in March and was quite excited about it. Thanks for providing so much valuable information to my parents and other families trying to figure all this out.
So I went through this phase where I worked with quite a few BSMD students. When I say a lot, I'm talking 3 to 5 a year, not like 10 or 15 or 20 a year. There's people that specialize in this. That's all they do. That was never me. But I think 3 to 5 is a lot. When I would talk with other counselors, they wouldn't work with that many. And if you do 3 to 5 for a decade or more, it's a pretty good number of students you've worked with doing BSMD programs, right? So, I'd say in my career, I've probably worked with 40 students doing BSMD programs or at least who came to me wanting to do BSMD programs. And I've been able to flip more than half of them to EAP programs, early assurance programs. I never started doing that. It was just when I started looking at the 2 and comparing them, and I became much more bullish and much more of a fan of EAP over BSMD. And these programs are extremely popular, and I hope it doesn't come off like I'm stereotyping here. I just feel like I need to be transparent. They're extremely popular with South Asian students from places like Sri Lanka and India. In fact, I remember one time I looked back at my records, and 8 students in a row that I'd worked with pursuing BSMD programs were from South Asia. There's also some interest in Southeast Asia in these programs as well. I've not seen as much interest in my experience from the Jewish community, from the white community, from the Black community, from the Latino community. But let's talk about what these programs are. And I'm going to share with you 9 cons and 4 pros But before I say any more, it just dawned on me. People might not know what I'm talking about. So let's talk about what a BSMD program is. So BS stands for Bachelor of Science and Doctor of Medicine. That's the MD. So this is a special combined program, a combined college and med school program. And what it does is it allows a high school student to apply for both undergraduate and med school admission simultaneously. All this occurs during the senior year of high school. It's the exact same timeline as any senior applying to any college. No different timeline. So how do they work? Well, sometimes you attend the same college for undergrad and grad school. That's the norm. That's the most common. But there are some that you move to partner medical school. Most of them, you do 4 years undergrad and then 4 years at the med school. So there's still 8 years like the traditional med school experience. But there are some that have 2 years and then 4 years. So there's some 6 years out there, and there's some that do 3 and 4. So there are some 6 and some 7, not a lot. I'll say more about that later. Now, why do people interested in these? Well, these programs offer a guarantee to med school if you get into them, which people feel, I'm already in med school. Well, all that pressure's off of me. But there are some conditions, and I'll say more about those conditions later as well. All right. Because I want to finish somewhat on an upbeat tone, I'm going to start out with the cons, and then I'll get to the pros. So we'll start with the cons, and then we'll get to the pros. So, and these, when I put something like this together, I don't know, maybe it's just the way my brain works. Maybe other people's brains are different. But when I put something like this together, I just list them in the order that they pop in my head, like when I'm preparing and I'm doing my research. That's just how it is. So I don't want you to think that number 1 is more important than number 9. This is just the order that they popped into my head when I was sitting down and I was thinking, what are the pros and what are the cons? Let me just grab a piece of paper and brainstorm, in my experience. So just know there's no sort of ranked order here. Okay, so the first con is, in my opinion, they have a poor ROI for their effort you have to put in. Poor return on your investment for the effort. In fact, I'll be really transparent with you guys. I try to always be that way. Sometimes I think I'm more transparent than other days. But I've seriously considered not taking on any more BSMD students. So you're like, why? Why would you consider that? Now, I have to tell you, I've considered that for the last few years, and I feel like I always end up with like 1 every year. But lately, I've been more successful at selling people on how the cons outweigh the pros. And let's look at EAP programs. So let's say you're a college counselor, and someone comes to you and they say, I'm only going to be happy if I go to Harvard, Yale, Stanford, Princeton, MIT, Caltech, Duke, Brown, or Columbia. Well, if you're a school-based counselor, you just kind of have to work with that. Like when I was a school-based counselor, and also when I was a CBO counselor, you kind of just have to work with, you don't get the ability to choose who you work with when you're in a CBO or a school-based capacity. So it kind of is what it is. You just sort of have to work with someone if that's what they say. But when you're an independent counselor like I am now, you don't have to work with that client. Most people I know that have enough business that they don't just have to take a client to feed their family or whatever, they're not going to take that client on if that's what they say. Why? Because all of those schools have extraordinarily low admit rates, and there's a chance that a student won't get into any of them. And then you risk somebody feeling dissatisfied, like they paid money, they're expecting some kind of deliverable, like this is what I told you I wanted. So I intentionally mentioned those 9 schools, Harvard, Yale, Stanford, Princeton, MIT, Caltech, Duke, Brown, and Columbia, because I'm just going to share data from the company that I started. Those are the 9 hardest schools in the country to get into. That's why I picked them. Now, I'm not counting places like Juilliard or special conservatories. I don't work with that many students in that area. I work with a lot more athletes than I do with artists. So I can see the admit rates of some of these conservatories in Juilliard, and I know they're incredibly competitive, but I wasn't counting those schools. So if somebody came to you and that's all they're interested in, there's a good chance they're not going to be happy. And these are not easy applications. So there's a lot of time that people are putting in, a lot of time you're putting in. So you're like, well, stuck. Are they really that hard to get in? Yeah, they really are. So I'm just going to share some popular ones that are out there and let you know what the acceptance rates are. And by the way, Eva, I'm doing a deep dive on this. Sometimes I come to you guys, I have like 2, 3, 4, 5 topics like last week. This is it today. I'm answering this question, a deep dive, and then we're jumping to the J Hall interview. That's it. So one of the popular programs is the Rice Baylor program. Okay, that has a less than 1% admit rate. I talked when I was at Baylor, in April, we talked about this program when I was there and how difficult it is to get in. Okay, let's talk about the PPSP program, which is Case Western Reserves program. That program has an admit rate of 1%. They typically get 1,200 applicants to take 12 spots. Another famous program is the Plumey program at Brown, 2 to 3% admit rate. Another famous program, the HPME Northwestern, 2 to 3%. Like, these are lower admit rates than all of those schools that I told you about. The REMS program at Rochester. I actually have someone in the REMS program right now, and I'm going to share something about a story about that later because it'll make another one of the points that I'm talking about. But the REMS program's got a 2% admit rate at Rochester. Miami Miller program, 2 to 3% admit rate. Okay. BU's got a program, SMED, 5 to 7% admit rate. And then I'm going to talk a little bit more about this program a little later too. The UMKC program, there's a 6 to 7% admit rate. Another program that I've seen just extraordinary students not get into is Pitt's GAP program, 3% admit rate. Okay, I've never had anybody apply to this, but VCU's program, 5% admit rate. I've had students get in Augustus program, that's right here in Georgia, 10% admit rate. There are a few that are a little higher. Drexel, Swan, TC&J. I've had students get into those. FAU, CNSU, Toledo. They're low, but they're all. When I say a little higher, I'm talking like low teens. All right. And a lot of times when people come to you and they're interested in BSMD programs, they're interested in like Plumey and REMS and PITS and program and some of these other ones. Miller, they're interested in some of the hardest to get into programs in the country. That's really what they have their sights set on. So in my opinion, there's poor ROI for the effort. And so that's first reason. All right. Second reason is diminished self-confidence. So I said I would share another story with you from one of my students who's at REMS right now. That's Rochester's program. This is an extraordinary student. One of the top students I worked with, in her class. In every way, she was extraordinary. And you have to be to get into these programs. But one of the things that made her extraordinary, she had 4 years of exceptional medical-related activities on her resume, which, by the way, you don't have to have 4 years, but you have to have a lot for these programs. Doesn't matter, like, all the other stuff, if you don't have that. Because think about it. They're taking a chance that you're mature enough to know you want to be a doctor at like 17. And they don't want you getting there. And like 6 months in, you're like, I don't want to do this. So anyway, this student had like 4 years of really, really pretty extraordinary medical-related extracurriculars. And the way REMS works is they take the top 5% of their applicants and they have them come out for a 3-night, 4-day fly-in. Like, it's not really a fly-in. I shouldn't call it a fly-in. 4-day, 3-night, like, complete expo, like a program for the finalists. You're now one of our finalists. All right. And from that, they take like 10 from, not from the US, from the world. They take 10 people from the world. And they bring like between 30 to 40 people in for this. So, I'm talking with my student, she's like, like I said, really extraordinary. And she's telling me about the banquet, at this big banquet. And of course, they're going on and on and on. And, it's a couple of things, right? They know these are extraordinary students, but they're also trying to get their hooks in you and make you pick REMS if you're admitted. So the leader of the program says, at the banquet, All right, now we're going to have everybody stand up and share the medical research. Stand up and share the medical research that you've done so we could all be inspired by it. Can you imagine you're sitting there like, I don't have medical research. Like, what? So I'm talking to my student, and she came out of there with imposter syndrome. She was like, some students didn't have one patent. They had 2 medical patents. So anyway, obviously she's there now. She's a student there. So she's one of the ones that got it. So she had to be extraordinary, and I don't feel she had regrets. Like, she got into another competitor BSMD program and chose this one over another one. But so I'm not going to say they're not for anybody, but I'm just going to tell you all one of the reasons I don't like them. And I think the cons outweigh the pros. And one of them, the second reason, first one, poor ROI, such low acceptance rates. It's like just harder to get into than most IVs, and as harder than the hardest IVs and IV peer schools. Diminished self-confidence. All right, here's a third reason. To me, this is a pretty big one. You have limited your choices on your medical schools because there's not that many of these. And most of the time, you have to attend the medical school that's tied to your program. So my experience is very ambitious students, the kinds of students that get into these programs, they oftentimes don't just want to go to any medical school, but to quite selective medical schools. And they're just going to have a lot better options because there's so few schools out there offering BSMDs. And then there's not as many of the very super selective ones offering them. And by the way, I wasn't going to say this, but I will. Over the last several years, a number of people have dropped their BSMD programs. And I think I know why. This is just conjecture, speculation. I haven't talked to anybody. But look at it. You're medical school. You literally can say, we're not even going to take you right out of undergrad. We're going to focus on someone that has 4 years of undergraduate and it has at least a year or 2 real life experience. There's a lot of the med schools like that. So we're going to take a 24-year-old. We can look at everything they've done in college, not only their 4-year transcript and their MCAT, but we can look at all of their experiences they've had, medically related and not medically related. We can look at their writing, like recent writing coming from like a 23-year-old. We can look at interviews. We can look at recommendations, get a much better sense of their personal qualities versus a 17-year-old who can't possibly be as mature as that person and is much more likely to change their mind. So I just think that they've had too many people that either lacked maturity compared to that 24-year-old. I mean, they're usually extremely mature compared to people their age. And my guess is they've had a higher percentage of people that have said this isn't for them. It just makes sense because 17-year-olds generally don't know themselves as well as 24-year-olds. And they want to, they don't. And so that's just my theory on why a number of people that used to offer them don't offer them anymore. You're just going to have a lot more options. Now, not this last year, the year before, I worked with a student from New Jersey, and he got into a couple different BSMD programs. He got into the TCNJ program. They have a partnership with New Jersey Medical School and GMS. And he also got into the Drexel program. And he surveyed his options because this is kind of like what I said. He didn't get into like Plumie and some of the programs, that are people really covet to try to get in. That's the Brown program, Plumie. So then he said, you know what? I'm going to go to Pittsburgh. They've given me a decent enough merit scholarship. It's going to be affordable for our family. They've got great pre-med training, and I'm going to take my chances. And I would bet the house he will have no regrets. He will have no regrets. When I follow up, he will have no regrets. One of two things is going to happen, and this is my prediction. This is a little bit of conjecture on my part, but I'm just telling you what I believe will happen. either he will like his medical school options more than the two programs that he got into, or people do change their mind and they find out about other options and end up doing something different. But either way, I just predict right now, he will not have any regrets. So limited choices of med schools. Okay. Fourth reason. You just know yourself better. You just do. And I've kind of touched on this. I've talked about that's why I think one of the reasons why schools have walked away from these programs. Even after 2 years, because I do like early assurance programs, EAP programs, they, where you get admitted after a couple of years. I like those programs a lot. Once again, for people that really know they want to be a doctor. But either 2 years, or if you go the traditional route, 4 years of undergrad, and then apply, you just know yourself better. You're so much better positioned to know yourself. And maybe the thing that changes is not that you no longer want to be a doctor. Maybe it's, the kind of school you want to be a doctor at, or where you want to live, or whether you want to be in more of an large city, small city, college town, suburbs, remote rural. Like maybe it's something like that. Or there's just so many different things about yourself that you know. So I just feel like people just know themselves a lot better when they have a little bit more time, and it allows them to make more prudent decisions. So that's my fourth reason. All right, fifth reason. Not everybody wants to go to the same school for 7 or 8 years, and most of the programs are 8. Variety is the spice of life. I have a friend named Yuri, more of a professional friend, but we've known each other now for, 24 years. And he's been in admissions the whole time. We were talking not too long ago, just reflecting on our career, and he said, if I had to do it all over again, I wish I would have gone to a West Coast school. Now, you might think, oh, I get it. He wants to live in California. No, it's not the point he was making. He was like, I went to St. Paul's, which is a boarding school in New Hampshire. He's from New York City. Okay. It's like, I'm from New York City, Northeast. I go to St. Paul's, Northeast. And then all of his jobs, he went to Williams College after St. Paul's, Northeast. And then he was back working at St. Paul's in admissions for a long time. And he flipped to the college side for a while. Then he flipped, he was at Stony Brook, in Long Island. He was at a prep school in North. Anyway, getting caught up in a tangent. The point is, he's like, all I really know is the Northeast. And I just think it would have broadened my horizons if I would have had a different experience. And I often feel that way. A few years ago, I was working with a student right here in Georgia, Gwinnett County, about an hour from me. And this student was really, really torn between a couple schools. By the way, somebody wanted to be a doctor on the doctor path. Torn between University of Georgia and University of California, Santa Barbara, UCSB. And the family was having a really hard time, so we sat down and they said, what are the pros and cons to each? So I mentioned a lot of things. There's going to be massive financial savings, but it was a double doctor family. They'd kind of prepared to pay. Obviously, you stay in Georgia, you pay zero tuition with the Zell Miller scholarship we have here. So obviously financially, but they knew that. But the main thing I said is UGA is going to be comfortable for you compared to UCSB. You're going to have a whole bunch of your people. She was at one of these schools that where basically probably all 10 students in the top 10 will apply to Georgia and Georgia Tech, which is pretty common here, by the way, in the public schools here. And pretty much no other public school really yields against those two. Some people will look at, privates, but that's another story. So you're going to go to school with a whole bunch of students, like from her school. This is one of these schools that hundreds of people apply to UGA. But if you go to UCSB, it's going to produce more growth because you're going to be living in a completely different environment. It's totally different than anything you've ever experienced. It's going to produce more growth. So you have to choose. Do you prefer the comfort and the easier transition, or something that steps outside your comfort zones that will produce more growth, but it's going to be harder? And of course, it's the money factor. Well, make a long story short, she chose UCSB, and I did talk with her mom recently, and we had a long conversation about the growth that she experienced. So anyway, do you want to be at the same school for 7 or 8 years? Not everybody does, and that's really what you're committing to. I realize some of these programs allow you to go to another partner school, so there are some options, but most of them are the same school. All right, let's talk about the 6th point. Stress levels. Stress levels. Some of them just give you an imbalanced life. I'm just going to put it out there. All right. When you've been doing this a while, you have a lot of stories. And I think stories are, you guys know this if you heard what I said about personal statements last week. Stories are personal, persuasive, interesting, and memorable. So I'm going to share a story with you from a mom who I was working with who attended a BSMD program herself. Son also wanted to be a doctor. And he was open to BSMDs, certain types. This was when I was able to convince to do an EAP. But anyway, that's getting off on a tangent. But the mom attended a program that UMKC has. That's University of Missouri, Kansas City. This is kind of a famous program within the BSMD world because it's a highly structured program. They waived the MCAT, and it's one of the few that's left at 6 years. So the mom attended this program. And when she was talking with me, I never forget. There's 2 things she said to me that really stood out. One was, she said, these schools don't want to be 80% South Asian. So South Asian family. So I hope you're taking that in consideration when the advice that you give. Which I appreciated her saying that, by the way. And then the second thing she said is, I was back at UMKC recently. Those kids were so stressed out. I wouldn't wish that on my worst enemy. You don't forget when somebody says something like that to you. So stress levels. So she's like, we're not interested in anything like that at all if we go that way. All right, 7th reason, 7th con. Sometimes you have limitations on your college experience because of the demands of the program. Like some of them just don't give you the flexibility to do some of the things that you may want to do with internships, study abroad, and other things because of, the nature of the program. Now, all of them are different. Some of them still allow you to be a traditional student, but some of them don't. And so to me, that's another con. You got to look in the devil's in the details, as they say. You got to look at the details. 8th reason. Some of the programs restrict your major. You're not going to have restrictions on your major if you go the traditional route or what we talked about last week a little bit, post-baccalaureate route. You're not going to have those restrictions. But some of them have restrictions. For example, Howard University, their program, they require you to be a science major. The Stony Brook University Scholars Program, they are limited to biology or pre-approved science majors. You don't need to be a biochem or biochem major to get into med school. We talked about that. Virginia Commonwealth's Guaranteed Admission Program, they strongly encourage you to major in the sciences. UIC, University of Illinois, Chicago, you must choose a major in the biological science, chem, or STEM-related field. And there's others as well. I just finished talking about UMKC, highly structured program, 6-year focused program on sciences. So there's others as well. Florida Atlantic. I can mention others that are restrictive. So to me, that's a major con when you look at these programs. All right, let's talk about another con. Then we can get to some of the pros. So let's talk about why people are so interested in these programs. They go because they think, phew, all the pressure is off. I'm in med school and I'm 17 or 18. Cartwheel time. But this is actually not completely true. You can't just go sauntering in with your 2.9 GPA or your 3.1 or 3.2 GPA or your 2.7 GPA in college and think you're getting in. You still have to perform. You still have to produce. Oftentimes you have to maintain a high GPA. 3.5 is pretty common, and I've even seen 3.7. And remember, they're not just looking at your overall GPA, but your BCPM GPA, biochem, physics, math. And not all of them waive the MCAT either. That's a medical college admission test, entrance exam for med school. You still have to meet specific program benchmarks. So all the pressure is not completely off. All right. Stuck, are you saying nobody should do these? No. There are people for whom they make sense. Why would they make sense for some people? Because there are some pros. And I'm going to share, 4 or so pros, maybe a fifth, depending on, what you think of one of these. Let's talk about the pros. One of the pros is that some of these programs, they really prepare people well if you want to do research and clinical work really early, because they're set up to expose you and allow you to do clinical and research work really early. Now, that's obviously a real big plus if you want to do that. You can really have some amazing accomplishments. Now, part of my pushback to that would be take a look at like the STH program at UAB. UAB, University of Alabama, Birmingham, is kind of a medical powerhouse. It's not a name just in and of itself that oozes prestige when someone says University of Alabama, Birmingham. But if you're in the know, all of their programs are strong. Like whether it's occupational therapy, nursing, pre-dentistry, all their medical programs, physician assistant, they're just really strong. Like almost half the people go there for medical related majors. They touch 5 hospitals. It's just a really strong program. Had a lot of people do that program over the years. But they have a program called STH, Science Technology Honors Program. They take like 50 students in. I had one student, I just remembering back, boy, he had a grueling decision. Does he do the STH program or does he go to Emory? That was a tough one, but he did pick STH. That program gets you doing clinicals and stuff right in month 1. Okay, and it's not a BSMD. So there are other alternatives, but I do have to say that's a positive. You want to do clinical work, you want to do research, you want to get exposure early. Some of the programs really do set you up, getting you into rotations and things really early. So that's a positive. Another pretty big positive, and I remember a student I was working with from Florida. He's right now in a BSMD program. This was a really big deal to him. So one of the things I like about these programs is they get you into a medical school cohort really early. So there are kids, and I work with a lot of them, that they've wanted to be a doctor since before they were 10. Most of the time, not always, they have doctors as parents. So they've been exposed to the field, and they know they wanted to do this from a really young age. You can get into a medical cohort really early. What I mean by that, you're starting to build your network. You're building friendships with future doctors at 18, 19. That's who you're hanging out with. That can be really appealing. And that has been one of the reasons I've had students that's tipped them in the edge of, I hear the cons stuck, I hear this, but I still think the pros outweigh the cons. I work with a sizable number of students in the South Asian community, and a lot of times they will say to me, I want to go to a place with a decent number of South Asians. That's really, really common. Well, you're going to find them there. You can be in a really nice cohort of other South Asian on a track to be doctors at a young age. Like that's a pretty cool affinity group. To me, that's one of the biggest positives. I can't deny it. And I will share that with people. All right. Another positive for some people, it's not true for everybody, but for some, and you can get a medical degree in 6 or 7 years. There are some 6-year programs out there, and there's some 7-year programs out there. Now, there are less 6 and 7-year programs out there now than there used to be. Dave and I were talking about that a while ago. It's like when I was going, there were so many more options for 6 and 7-year programs. Those are mostly gone now. But there's still some that are out there. So if you want to shave 1 year off or even 2 years off, now just know sometimes there's devil's in the details, right? It may involve summers to make up for that time. So you're not getting your R&R. That's a factor. But Cal State Northridge, they've got a 6-year option. UMKC, I mentioned. Howard's got one. Then there's some 7-year programs that are out there. SUNY Upstate. I've got somebody interested in that program this year, actually. USF, Mahari, partnership with Fisk in Nashville, Toledo, CUNY. I've had students admitted to that. TCNJ, had students do that. Albany, RPI, Florida International, and George Washington. I've had students do that. Those are 7-year programs. So if saving a year or two, being a doctor maybe at 22 or 23 is really appealing, that could be a positive that I can't deny. Now, I know what some people are saying, Stuck, you're not giving all the positives. A lot of people will talk about the removal of stress of getting into med school early. But once again, EAP offers that. And I can't stress this enough. If you can get into a BSMD program with their 1 and 2 and 3% admit rates, trust me, you're going to have no problem getting into extraordinary medical schools if you go the traditional route. So to me, the removal of stress of not knowing you have to go through that stuff, MCAT, med school, that's more about educating somebody. Like, to just let them know, like, I think you're worrying about something you don't need to worry about. So to me, that's not a major factor. And like I said before, there's still conditions anyway. And then a lot of people will talk about waiving the MCAT. That's a huge thing that people will say when I say, why don't you do them? Why do you want to do this? Well, I like the idea of waiving the MCAT. Well, once again, there's many EAP programs that waive the MCAT. Furthermore, there's a strong correlation between the SAT and the MCAT. If you're getting 1550 to 1600, which by the way, these programs are very test score oriented. Even test optional colleges will oftentimes not be test optional for their BSMDs. And normally it's a minimum of 1550 for most of the programs. That's like the minimum. There are a few exceptions, but there's not a lot of programs out there if you think your 1390, which is a really good SAT score, is going to get you into. So if you're getting 1550 to 1600, which is just the expectation, someone just literally put it right out there, right on their websites, like 1550 or more to be competitive. Very common for you to read that for these programs. You're going to have no problem doing on the MCAT. You're a good tester. So to me, I don't really list that as an advantage. To me, it's a perceived advantage. It's just about the education. You should know, like, you're not the kid who has to worry about doing well on the MCAT. You got a 1590. You're fine. All right. Now, what's the other one that I said you may count, you may not count? Some people like these programs because there is prestige of getting into BSMD programs. So they would say that's a big factor for a lot of students, the prestige of the program. But one of my thoughts on that is prestige where? Like, most people haven't even heard of these programs. So, and then even for people that know about them, they don't necessarily think that they're always all that in a bag of chips either, for all the reasons I mentioned. So I know in certain communities it's a big deal. I worked with a student who actually he's right now at a BSMD program. He's at the EMSAP program, which is UAB's program. And he's there. But yeah, is it super competitive? Yes. They get over 400 apps every year to their program. And they're only taking five out-of-state students. 13 in-state, 5 out-of-state. And this was an out-of-state student. So the acceptance rate, like all these is, sub 5, 3-4% out-of-state. In-state's a little easier. We get approximately 83 applications, take about 13. So if you're in Alabama, your chances are about 1 in 6. Once again, when they lay out all the criteria, it's a very selective group of 1 in 6. Because when they all criteria out, most people will be like, I don't have that criteria, so I'm not applying. But why am I telling you this story? This student, and I'm not advocating for this, I'm not a fan of this. I tried to talk him out of this. I was not successful. He wanted to apply to the Ivies just to see if he would get in. I really hate it when somebody tells me that, but I don't get to control what everybody does. But he made it really clear. I'm not going. I don't care which Ivy I get in. I'm going to go to BSMD, but I'm just curious about getting Ivies. So why was he saying that? It's just a prestige within, his culture for these programs. So I guess in fairness, you can judge for yourself whether you think that's an extra bonus or not. I'm not the biggest person on prestige. I'm not saying it's not a positive. It's better to have it than not have it. I just don't put as much weight on it as most people do. And I especially don't put weight on it when people haven't even heard of the program. So prestige in what, a very small group of people would see it that way. But I would be remiss to not mention it as a reason. Well, hopefully you enjoyed this breakdown, pros and cons of BSMD programs. Eva, send us in another question. Thank you for your kind words about our podcast. Thanks to your mom for her kind words about our podcast. And don't be afraid to request your book. We still have, 77 or so to give away. So take advantage of them while the offer's on. And thanks to the generosity of the Princeton Review for sending in that SpeakPipe question, you are going to get your choice of one of the following 4 books: College Admissions 101, Essays That Kicked Apps, The Best 390 Colleges, Princeton Review Digital SAT Prep. Now, in order to get your book, you just need to send me an email at mark@schoolmatch4u.com, put Princeton Book Giveaway in the subject line, and in the body of the email, put the title of the book you want and put the episode number where we discussed your question, and just share a brief description of the question that you asked. All right, let's transition to a brand new interview with Jay Hall. Lynda conducted in May. I think you're going to really like it. It's a good one.
And now this week's interview with a special guest.
Friends, I'm really stoked about this interview that Lynda Depker did with Jay Hall. Jay's an author, podcaster, educator, college dean, and he's written a book, College Unpacked, that's got some great content in there that we think you're going to find very interesting. This is going to be especially helpful for recent high school grads who want to successfully transition to college, have a smooth transition, what you should be doing over the summer, how to have a great first year experience. That's their focus over the next 4 weeks. So in part 1, Jay gives his backstory. And like me, he came to college-related advising from Christian ministry, and he did it for the exact reason I did it. Jay explains why he wrote the book, College Unpacked. He explains what the heartbeat of the book is. Jay tells us what are the biggest things rising college students need to do over the summer before they enroll in college. Jay talks about some basic skills he has seen that college students lack, and he focuses on 2 very important skills, and he tells us what they are. Jay shares something he wants students to do when they are hanging out with their friends, and it may surprise you what he says. Lynda and Jay talk about the importance of the syllabus. Jay gives advice for parents on moving day, what parents can do. And Jay shares a great idea a student can set up with their parents in advance to let their parents know when it is time to go. Listen and enjoy.
This is Lynda, one of the co-hosts of Your College Bound Kid, and I am excited to chat today with Jay Hall, author of College Unpacked, a practical guide to choosing, preparing for, and excelling in college. Jay, welcome to YCBK.
Thanks, Lynda. I'm excited now.
Wonderful. So, Jay, if you would, please tell us a little bit about your background and how you came to write about education.
I have been in higher ed for about 20, which feels like a really long time now that I say it out loud. I've had a chance to work in large public institutions. I worked at the University of Oklahoma. I've worked in small private Christian institutions, and currently am the Dean of Social at Oklahoma City Community College, which obviously is in Oklahoma City. It's a mid-size urban community college that serves Oklahoma County. So we have rural and urban and suburban and lots of different kinds of students. I came to higher education out of ministry. Actually worked in professional ministry with junior high college students for another 15 years. So suddenly I'm aging myself quite a bit there. And went back to grad school while I was working at a church, and just fell in love with education, higher education in particular, and really the potential for transformation. I say all the time that education is transformative for individuals, families, and communities, and just saw my path as having the opportunity to work with students of all ages, races, backgrounds, whatever, to help be an agent of that kind of transformation. So moved away from professional ministry, moved into higher ed full time. I spent most of my career in higher ed as an administrator. I've always taught as an adjunct. But I had to fire myself a couple of times because I just had too many other things going on in my quote unquote day job, I guess. But I've loved working with students. And so you asked how that led me to write about higher ed. One of the things that I discovered and have observed over years and years of working with students is a lot of students struggle not because they are not prepared academically, not because they're not smart enough, whatever that means for college, but because they don't understand this really convoluted environment that we've created in higher education. I was actually trying to write a more in book about college and about higher ed, and had a set of conversations with students as I was in the process of that that made me realize that really what they needed was information. They were inspired to be there. They knew what they were there for. They were just struggling to navigate this wild system. So College Unpacked became my attempt at making the whole system just more clear so that students and their parents can come on campus and get into it with some confidence that even if they don't have all the answers, they at least know where to look. And I think that's the heartbeat of the book is from where am I going to go to school to what happens if I get in trouble with a professor. Just an idea of how to navigate this system is really important to me. And so my goal is to get that out there so that students have some of those tools.
Yeah, I love that about the book because it is very, like, have you thought about this? And a lot of speaking for myself, way back in the day, I hadn't thought about a lot of the things that you cover. And you do cover a lot of ground in the book, but I want to talk about the preparing for and excelling in college. We're chatting the end of May. So class of 25, finish their AP tests. They're getting ready to graduate or getting ready for graduation parties, and they still have work to do.
That's right.
So let's talk about what are some of the things that students should be working on, or what do colleges expect of the students this summer before they arrive on campus?
I think the second way you ask that question is the way that's really, because to me, the biggest task that students can be working on now is learning to communicate the way your school communicates. Because the reality is, most of the communication that happens between and incoming students is different than the way students interact with each other or anyone else in their world. Odds are really good. You've been accepted. Congratulations, by the way. You have now a college email and you have access to some kind of portal. That is where you're going to sign up for classes. It's where you're going to buy your parking sticker. It's where you're going to get your dorm assignment. It's where you may meet your roommate. These things are going to happen in this portal. And the odds are good that most college-bound students don't spend a lot of time communicating that way. So one of the things I tell students and their families, set an alarm, put it on your phone at 10 a.m. or 10 p.m. or whatever, every day between now and the time that you get to campus to check your email and check that portal. And most days there won't be anything that you need. But on a random Tuesday, hey, this is your chance to buy parking and you don't want to miss that. Or this is your chance to sign up for your room and you don't want to miss that. It's also really good practice because the reality is when you get to campus, that's also how your professors are going to communicate and how you're going to access everything for your courses. So you might as well get used to it now. That email and those portal communications, it's not the way, I will readily admit that, but it's the way that's set up to happen. And whether we like it, love it, however we feel about it, that's what they're going to do. So I think, and I also think it's really important that the student do that. Easy for parents to say, I'll check it out. I've got your, login information. I'll go check it every day. Well, that's not going to help your student when they get to campus. Or at least it shouldn't, because you shouldn't be doing that for their classes. So I think that's a really, really important big first that is a primary task of the summer.
And I don't understand why it's so tough for students to do this, because I know that they have those phones in their hot little hands all the time, and they're checking on TikTok or Instagram or Discord or something like that. So you can check your email once a day.
I think it's just apps that they don't normally use, because you're right. They've been using TikTok and Instagram or whatever for years. Some students may not know there's a mail app on their phone because they just don't operate through email.
Right. It is entirely possible that may be the case. And, I think some students are surprised by, like, you may have literal homework
Yeah,
to be doing over the summer. There may be reading assignments. You may have placement tests that you need to take before you schedule. You may have to meet with an academic advisor at some point during the summer. So there are things that you actually need to do. So important to get used to checking that email and that portal. Yeah.
absolutely. And I want to mention just real quick, I'm glad you said something about placement testing. I don't know students always fully appreciate the gravity of those tests. And I don't want to say this in a way that, you'll summer for your math placement test, but that's how they decide what math class you go into. And I have seen students who did very well in high school who blew that test off or whatever and stuck in a remedial math course, not because they weren't capable, but because they just didn't pay attention to it. So, yeah, I think is a good way to say it. You thought you graduated, you thought you were done with homework. Nah, we're just handing off a whole different.
Yeah, it's a whole nother level. And for those placement tests too, I know I've seen students who will study for those placement tests, get into the higher level, and then realize, oh, maybe I want to
Right.
slow things down. So, you just need to pay attention because they do matter quite a bit. So check email, number one. But what are some of those other basic skills, that as parents that we take for granted? And it's so easy for us to do things for our kids. And we're all guilty of that. I think I had an epiphany one day, like, why am I doing the dishes? I don't need to
Right.
do this anymore when I have this child here who's perfectly capable of loading a dishwasher. Theoretically, of course.
Right.
So what are some of those kinds of skills that I'm sure you have seen college students lack?
I think there's a couple that are really important. The first one is communication. Something generationally, and this is not the old guy saying these kids these days, that's not it. I think COVID really hurt how the generation communicates because they lost, some of them at a really critical point, opportunity to engage with people face to face, and then came back to a world where so much communication had been shifted to online texts. I mean, even like we're doing now via Zoom, where you're not face to face, sitting, looking at a person, interacting with that person in the same space. And I think our students have lost some of the ability to do that. And I think one of the big challenges that they face when they get to college to meet people again for the first time. You're having to interact with authority figures in a different way. Professors aren't like high school teachers. All the different administrators that you're going to be working with at the college level aren't like the ones in lots of different ways. Especially if you're going to a large school, you're one of 30,000. And so, you need to be able to advocate for yourself. I have students come into my office all the time who are trying to accomplish something. And number one, they're nervous. And I don't think I'm a very intimidating person, so I don't think it's because of me. I think it's because they're going into the distance, and that's scary. But also, they don't seem to be able to communicate, this is the thing I need to have happen for me. And I've had students before come in and go into a 10-minute monologue about on and what's wrong. And once they come up for air, I will stop and say, what do you want out of this conversation? What do you think is a solution? What do you need? And they just freeze because they don't know how to advocate for themselves without breaking into emotion or breaking into blaming somebody, that kind of thing. So I think learning to self-advocate, learning just to communicate, learning to communicate with people who are older than you are, who are in some kind of authority, and parents can help with that. When you've got a question with the college, mom and dad, don't call. Have your student call and ask these questions. We had this thing happen. My youngest daughter's getting ready to be a nursing student at University of Oklahoma. Set of really confusing instructions about what she needed to do. And she asked me, she asked my wife, and we were trying to help. And eventually there were some things we couldn't answer. And so we said to her, you're going to have to call them. And she's a pretty functional human being, but even at 20 years old was like, I don't know if I want to do that. Well, you got to do that, right? So I think being, a student in the position where they have to advocate for themselves and ask those kind of questions. The other one, beyond communication, I think is time management. High school functions in such a way for most students, and I know this isn't everybody, where it's hard to get behind unless you choose to get behind because you're constantly being reminded, here's the update, you're seeing those teachers every day, you're kind of in that same space. College doesn't operate like that. Your professor may or may never tell you that something is due. You've got a syllabus, you've got a schedule, you need to know when it is. All of us, because I did this, when I started college, I knew I could keep it all in my head. And that fell apart about 2 weeks in when the first round started being due, because none of us are that good in our heads. So over the summer, if you don't have a time management, if you don't have a calendar you're using, whether it's paper or iCal or whatever, start using it. Scheduling like I'm going to go hang out with my friends just to get used to that process of I have a thing, I need to put it in my calendar, I need to put it in whatever my system is, so that when you get to campus and you're overwhelmed with 5 or 6 syllabi and tons of due dates, tons of places you have to be, you've already got a plan in place for how to navigate that.
The scheduling of time is so important. And you mentioned schedule time with friends. I think students really should incorporate that into it, because otherwise you may end up hanging out with your friends all the time, or maybe equally as bad is never hanging out with friends. So
Right.
you need to make sure that you have some balance in there. And you touched on syllabus. Students, please, please, please read the syllabus and
Read the
the
syllabus.
whole thing, because they're all different. And like grading is different. I've given up trying to understand my own students. The grading system is different for every
Sure.
single class, every single quarter. I have no idea. I'm just like, are you passing? So make sure, students, that you read that, please.
Well, you're being given the roadmap, right? I mean, you're being given, here's everything you need to, almost like you're getting some kind of secret insider information, but you're not. It's the same information. I am shocked. And I've seen tons of videos and know tons of examples of professors who put little Easter eggs in their syllabus, email me if you this or email and I'll do this, and still have almost no on it, even year over year when the word should be getting out, right? That this is something this professor does. Read the syllabus. Why would you not?
Yeah, it's easy. And you can probably do it on that phone that's in your hand. Um, I know. Can you tell? It's a trigger
Your
point
focus
for
there for
me.
sure.
Yeah, yeah. So students are getting ready. They're going to move in August. Talk about that, because that actual move-in day is such a seminal point
Yeah.
in this. It's really for the parents, like it's a big letting go. For the students, it's exciting and filled with anxiety. If they have been planning dorm decor, there might be some very serious mood board action going on.
Yes.
What do you see as the parents' role on that day to make it a happy, I'm not going to say stress-free,
No.
but less stressful day for everyone?
So I've done this 4 times. I have 4 kids. I have moved each of them into dorms. Every experience was a little bit different. Some were great, some were less great. And I'll not elucidate any of that. I think there's a couple of things that are critical. And one is, and just mom and dad, hang on to something. This day is not about you, which is really hard because that this is our kid and this is our world and go, and we're emotional, and all of that is true. Trust me, I've done the driving away with tears in my eyes 4 times, including twice for daughter literally moving 20 minutes from me. So it wasn't like I was leaving them behind, but there's just something about that transition. But I think realizing this is their day. And so what does that mean? Well, that means when they're ready for you to leave. And I saw a really cool deal where this mother had set up kind of a signal that when the daughter made the bed, it was time for mom to go.
Friends, this concludes this part of my interview with Jay Hall. Hope you join us next week for the next part. On Thursday's episode, Susan and I will answer a question from a listener who wants advice about architecture programs for an architectural student. And we'll have a brand new interview with my colleague, Jennifer Mandel. And it's an interesting interview because we bounce around and cover 4 distinct topics over 4 weeks. I think you're going to like it. On this week's episode, we'll be talking about the importance of clubs and how the clubs that you select as a student can really catapult you into some really good career opportunities. And then we'll have part 3 of my interview with Dr. Bob McMahon, the president of Kettering University. And what are we talking about? Kettering University. And friends, remember, it's not where you go. It's not where you go. It's not where you go. You know, I used to be a preacher, so I got to pound the pulpit every now and then. It's what you do when you get there. It's what you do when you get out of there. That is what will determine your career success, your career trajectory. And I believe that with every fiber of my being. See you on Thursday, friends. And that's our show. A big thank you to you, our listeners, for tuning in this week. If you find this podcast helpful, please follow us and you will get every single episode as soon as they are released. If you want to support our podcast, you can click the share button and send it to your friends and acquaintances. You can say positive things about your college-bound kid on your social media feed. And you can help us stay commercial-free and pay our staff by donating on the yourcollegeboundkid website. You can write a review for us on Apple or Spotify. And if you have a question or a recommendation, just go to speakpipe.com/YCBK, hit the orange button, and speak. We will do our best to get your question in your own voice on an upcoming episode. I am the producer of the podcast, and I live in Metro Atlanta. We have a fantastic team that has over 200 years of admissions and counseling experience. Shout out to our co-hosts, Dr. Lisa Ruff in North Carolina, Susan Tree in Pennsylvania, Vince Garcia in California, Julia Esquivel in Massachusetts, Lynda Depker in Missouri, Andy Strickler, the Chief Enrollment Officer at Connecticut College, New London, Connecticut, Hillary Dickman, an Admission Officer at Colorado College in Colorado Springs, and our International Admissions Expert, Kevin Newton in Dallas, Texas. Our sensational sound engineer is Nemanja Motvich. Our amazing music is from Victor Allen Weeks. Marketing designs from Kimberly Bloss. Our reliable webmaster is Stylionis Dimitru. Website updates are done by Joyce Stucker. Our image editor is Vlad Honchar. If you want to have a coaching session with me, just text me at 404-664-4340. If you want to reach someone else on our team, all of our bios with contact info can be found at yourcollegeboundkid.com under the About YCBK tab. If you want to get our free monthly YCBK newsletter, YCBK Plus, it is also under the About YCBK tab. If you want to see our recommended books and websites, they are on our website under the Resources tab. While you're on our website, check out our hundreds of interviews in their entirety. Check out our college spotlights, our blog, and our upcoming events. We think of you as our listening family, and we look forward to meeting with you every single Monday and every single Thursday.